Hey everyone, welcome to Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. Super excited to get back and continue our journey building the Spotify app. When we last left off, we were on the screen where we were working in the menu bar, and we had playlists, artists, albums, and we have some different views that enable us to scroll to display these different buttons. What we're going to do in this episode is we're going to hook up the interactions of these buttons with the views. So when you tap, it will display the proper view below. When you scroll here, it will highlight and show you which button is selected. And finally, we're going to look at all the magic that goes into making this green indicator bar slide underneath each selection here. Okay, let's begin. Okay, when it comes to the menu bar interactions, there's three interactions we want to take a look at. One is what happens when someone taps a button on the menu bar. Two is what happens when someone swipes the entire view left and right. And three is the scroll, where it's an incremental scroll backwards and forwards. It's not a full swipe, and you'll note how that basically enables us to move that green slider back and forward there. So those are the three interactions we're going to look at. Let's start with this very first one, the menu bar tap. Okay, the menu bar tap is a nice, straightforward callback where basically when someone selects one of those buttons in our menu bar at the very top, we're going to create a protocol delegate pattern to basically call back to the home controller and say, hey, someone did select our item at this index, which will be the index of the button. We can then use that index to scroll to the appropriate item on our collection view underneath. So that's how we're going to handle the menu bar tap. So to implement this, let's go back into Xcode, Command 0 to bring up our menu bar over here. It's also another nice little shortcut. If you want to see where this class is in the hierarchy here, go Shift Command J, and that will immediately bring up in the left panel here where you are in your project. So in our case, to do all this work in the menu bar, let's go back to our menu bar, and let's start by defining that protocol. So this is the protocol delegate that our menu bar is going to create to basically tell our home controller, hey, this is what they selected when they tapped our button. So we can do that by just starting by creating a protocol. Let's call this the protocol menu bar delegate. And it's going to be any object here. This is just the pattern that you currently follow in Swift to define a protocol like this. And this protocol is basically going to be an interface which has a function called did select item at. I'm just going to go Command period to turn off the debugger here so I get better autocomplete. And in there, when we select our index, we want to pass back the index that was selected. So I'm going to call this a selected item at, and I'm just going to go index and make that an int. That's going to be the button that was tapped. Now that we've got that, we need to have a reference to someone who registers themselves as a protocol for us. So we can do that just in here. Let's go weak var delegate, and this will be our menu bar delegate. Now, note a couple things here. One, this is weak, and we purposely want this to be weak because with the protocol delegate, whoever registers themselves for us, we don't want to get into a retain cycle and retain a strong reference to them. So we make this weak so that basically if they go away, we're not holding on to them strongly. And this is going to be optional, meaning that no one has to register themselves as delegate for us, but we're just going to make it optional so that if they do, we can call them. But this is typically how you do a protocol delegate in Swift. So now with this delegate set up, which our home controller is eventually going to register itself for, we can now go down here and actually put it to use. So if someone taps our playlist button, we want to call our delegate and basically say, hey, someone did select us, and they selected us for our playlist, which has an index of 0. And if someone selects our artists, they're going to have an index of 1. And if someone selects album or taps that, that's going to have an index of 2. And this is how we're going to fire the callback, send that message back up to the home controller, who will then read it, and they can scroll to the appropriate place. So let's go back to our home controller now and put this to use. So to basically implement or handle or register ourselves as the someone who handles this protocol, I'm going to come down here and create an extension on our home controller and it is going to implement that menu bar delegate protocol we just defined. And as soon as we do that, Xcode is nice enough, it's going to let us know, hey, you are not implementing all the required functions. Would you like me to fill those in for you? And we will say, yes, thank you. And now we just have to decide, well, what do we want to do when they pass us back the index of what is selected? And for here, what we can do is this is coming back to us as an int, but what we really need to work on our collection view is something called an index path. So we're going to take that int and from it create an index path, which we can do like this. Index path item. And this is going to be the index at section 0. And then we can basically use that on our collection view. So collection view, and here's the magic right here. We're going to go scroll to item at index path. This is the thing that was selected. And for scroll position, we don't really need to fill anything in there. We're just going to pass it an empty array, and we would like animated to be true. So we are set up now to handle that delegate being called, but what we haven't done yet is basically registered ourselves as the protocol. So basically somewhere in here, when we're getting ourselves set up, let's see. I think view did load is a good place to do this. Let's go right in here, and on our menu bar, all we need to do now is register ourselves as the delegate. So we're saying, hey, I'm going to handle any calls to you. If anything interesting happens to you, let me know. I'm registered as your delegate. And that's what hooks this up to that logic that we just added down here. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. Let's go Command R. And if we tap on our buttons now, hey, look at that. We are moving and scrolling to each of those cells in those are our playlist cells. As we tap, we're scrolling to the appropriate view. That's great. That's exactly what we want. For our second interaction, let's go and do this collection view swipe. So this is basically where we are going to be swiping here like this, or in our case this, and we want to tell our home controller, hey, what view did we swipe to? So that when we get that, we can then select the appropriate index here and make something slightly more interesting happen. So let's go ahead and hook that up. So the way we know which index we're at when we're scrolling here is there's a nice little callback that gets called in our collection view called scroll view will end dragging. And this gets fired every time we complete one of these scrolls. Now what's really nice about this is there's an attribute on here called target content offset .ex, which tells us the x value of where our scroll finished. So if we finish a scroll on the very first screen here, our x value will be the width of the screen, which in our case is 414. If we scroll over one more when we did finish scrolling, our x is now 828, 2 screen widths, and so on when we go to the third. So if we want to know what index we're at after we're done scrolling, all we need to do is to take that x value passed back to us as of the scroll and divide it by the frame's width, 414. That will give us an index of 0, 1, or 2, which we can then convert into an int and call on a function we're going to create on our menu bar called select item. If we flip over to our menu bar, which I'm going to get to by going Shift Command O and typing menu bar, we can basically put that function that we want to handle the selection in an extension like this. I mean, I could have put this function in the main menu bar itself, but sometimes I like just to separate these interactions and put them on their own. So we're going to call select item with the index that was selected, which we just calculated, 0, 1, or 2. And what we want to do is we want to animate or somehow change the alpha of these buttons as we swipe. So you can see the alpha on these ones is actually kind of a darker gray. That's because we've set the alpha to 0.5, and it's only on the one that's currently selected where the alpha is 1. So to do that, what we can do is we can take the index we've got, figure out which button was selected based on its index, and then set the alpha for that particular button. So here's the function where we go set alpha. All I do in this case is I set the alpha at all the buttons to be kind of a darker gray by setting it to be 0.5. And then just on the one that's selected, I make that one 1. And once that's done, to give it that nice animation effect, we just put the call into AutoLayout, which will ask those buttons to re-render themselves based on their alpha. We can put that in a little animation block just like this. And if we run this now when we swipe, we'll get a nice effect. Whatever index we're on is the one that will be highlighted at the top. The only thing we're missing is when we first started up the app, it wasn't clear which button should be highlighted. So if we go up to our init here, and right before we do layout, we just call set alpha for playlist button, and we run it. Now when the app starts up, our playlist button will be highlighted, and we should have some nice swiping and some nice interaction, basically showing which buttons are highlighted as a result of where we currently are in our swipe. All right, good stuff. Now, before we jump into this third interaction, I just want to kind of show you and make you appreciate what's going on in the Spotify app when they do this animation, swiping left to right, and they update this indicator, because this was not trivial. This took me a long time to figure out. I'm not even sure how they do it exactly. I figured out a way of doing it, which I'm going to show you, but I just want you to appreciate what's actually happening here. First of all, when we swipe, that indicator changes, and notice that when it's a swipe, sorry, I'm going to call it scroll to differentiate between this kind of a swipe action. When we incrementally scroll here, that indicator slides over and back. So that's a cool interaction we're going to have to figure out how to do. Also notice how the playlist text itself is changing also. So that's tied to the animation. As we swipe, the labels themselves are animating in and out. But it doesn't stop there. Watch what happens to the width of the indicator as we bring it over. Right now it's the width of the label playlist, and as we bring it over, it shrinks to be the size of artists. And as we swipe over again, it expands a bit to become the width of albums. So there's a lot going on in here. And I'm just going to walk you through mechanically how we can solve this. Some of the things we can do, it's basically just a lot of math and bookkeeping, keeping track of where the indicator is and where to set these constraints. And then I'm just going to basically show you the solution and spare you a lot of time. We'll walk through it, of course, but I just want you to see and appreciate what's going on here before we do. Okay, let's take a look at how we're going to solve this. So the way we can animate that indicator is basically by taking advantage of another callback in our collection view called scroll view did scroll, which will return us the X coordinate of where our scroll is as we're slowly dragging that across the screen. We then basically need to take that, normalize it, and translate it into something that our indicator can use to figure out how much it needs to slide. So we're going to create a constraint on our menu bar, which basically represents the leading edge of our indicator here. We're going to add a new view, and that's how we can figure out how far to move it as we scroll. Now, all this would be very simple if our scroll view, our buttons were the same width going across the top. So for example, if we had a very simple YouTube looking like application, and I credit Brian Vong with showing me this technique, he built an app where basically they mimicked how the YouTube interactions work. And you can see there's some buttons up here, and each button is exactly the same width. And as you tap and as you swipe, you can see how that menu bar slides across. This is a much easier and nicer calculation because all you need to do in this case is figure out where you are in your scroll, divide it by 4, and then just set that indicator to be 1/4 the width of your screen. So this is a nice simple interaction. Ours, however, is quite a bit more complicated. Here on our menu bar, the widths aren't all the same uniform width. For example, the section here on playlists has a different width than artists. And artists has a different width than albums, and we don't go all the way across the screen. So what that means is we need to figure out what the width of each of these sections are, playlists, artists, and albums, and then dynamically apply that to the animation. Now it gets worse because in there, because our buttons aren't exactly the same width, we also need to take into account things like the padding. So we have some padding on the playlist here. Also, these section widths are going to be different, and we need to deal with the offset as we swipe. So for example, when we're looking at the playlist section here, it's going to have some padding on the left, say 16 points. We also need to animate and adjust that padding so that when we swipe, that indicator is just exactly the right width. So there's some math we can do to do that. So we need to take into account where we are in our swipe. And if we just had 8 points of padding here, we wouldn't want our animation to fully kick in until we exceeded that 8-point offset, and then we could apply normalization calculation to the percent scroll. So that's just the leading constraint. That's what enables us just to set the left, right of this indicator to properly align with these labels as we're swiping. But of course, we also need a trailing indicator, and that's what's going to set, that's what's going to set the width of this thing as we go across here. Sorry, I had a slight bug. So now you can see as we're swiping here, we want our trailing indicator to be completely flush with the end of the button as we swipe back and forth. So we need to normalize that too. There's a lot of magic going on in here, and we need to do that for each section. Each section is going to have a slightly different width. We need to go through and we need to set that up. And for this, I'm going to basically just put in the code step by step to show you what kinds of things we need to track and take care of. And then we'll walk the code slowly and I'll explain what's going on. But I'm going to spare you all the gritty details of how I actually got there. So let's take a look at that now. So getting back to the code, let's go back to our home controller. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out that nice code we just added for our scroll view did ending. These both can't be in play at the same time, because what we're going to do is we're basically going to replace the scroll view did ending with this new callback we're going to bring in. This is the scroll view did scroll. This is the thing that's going to give us our X, and this is the thing that's going to do our animation. These will conflict unless they don't perfectly line up. But because we're going to do a slow manual drag, which is going to end up exactly where this one was, we don't actually need this. The reason why I wanted to leave it in there though is because if you don't need this complex, more rich interaction, this is going to be good enough for you probably. This will let you select things. If you don't need that scrolling indicator, don't bother. It's quite a bit of work. But I still want to show you how you can create it. So we're going to come in here. We're going to comment that out, add in this scrolling here, and we're going to add a new method on our menu bar called scroll to indicator. But before we do that, let's go to menu bar and let me show you how we're going to set that up. So I'm going to go Shift Command O. Let's jump over to our menu bar. Let's go up to the top and let's just see how we can bring all this in. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a plain old innocent looking indicator, which is going to be that slider, which is going to go across back and forth. So we're going to create an indicator. It's just going to be a plain old UI view, and that's what's going to be representing this little green bar, which is going to animate back and forth. Now, in order to keep track of how wide this indicator should be, we're explicitly going to track a couple of constraints. We're going to track the indicator leading and the indicator trailing constraint explicitly. What that means is as we're sliding back and forth here, we're going to be dynamically updating and calculating these based on our scroll. I'm then going to add in some constants, which just do a little bit of padding for us because I've just tried out different padding scenarios and I found these to work best. This leading padding of 16 is going to be the spacing right here. And the button space of 36 is going to be the distance between the buttons here. We're going to use that in auto layout right there. Now to style our indicator, I'm just going to create a function called style indicator, and that's what's going to give it its nice green look and everything. So let's just give it a nice style indicator, and we will give it a nice style of this. So we're basically just going to make sure that it is set up for auto layout by making sure its auto size remasking is set to false, and we'll give that nice background of Spotify green, which we already defined here. Okay, now let's do the layout for the button, the indicator. We've already got our buttons laid out here nicely. I'm just going to copy over what we have here, and well, actually I'll do it piece by piece. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add the indicator. We're just going to plop that in there. We can't do any constraints against our indicator until it's in our view, so we'll go ahead and add that. Then I'm just going to replace the buttons we have instead of using 16 and 36, I'm going to go ahead and use those new values we've got of lead padding for the 16 here, and it's going to be button space for the 36 here. So I'm just going to replace those hard-coded numbers, put in the variables, and that is going to be laying out our buttons. Now for the indicator bar, there's just two auto layout constraints we're going to set up explicitly, which aren't going to change. So we can just plunk those in here like this. The bottom constraint, we're just going to pin to the bottom of our view. So it's just going to sit at the bottom of our menu bar here. And the height, we're going to give it a height of 3. That's what's going to make it 3 points high here. Now the two constraints that we do explicitly want to track are these leading and trailing ones, which are going to look like this. So whenever you want to actually track and keep track of constraint because you're doing some kind of animation like we're doing here, you explicitly have to grab them before you activate them. So in this case, we're just doing standard auto layout stuff. We're going indicator, leading anchor. I'd like the indicator to be lined up right to the edge of the playlist button right here. That's what this constraint's doing. And trailing, you go ahead and be right to the end of the playlist button here. So we just line those up and we grab those as variables, which we define up here as optionals. Once we've got our hands on those, we can activate them. This is what would normally happen if it was in this activation array, but here we're just going to do it ourselves. And now that we've got our hands on those, we're free to change those later on when we do the animation. And the animation, which is going to do all this great stuff for us, is outlined in this function here. Now, let me just run this to see if this is working, and just to make sure that we can walk this. And then we'll go through this in excruciating detail, and I'll share with you everything that is going on. So yes, we can scroll. Yes, that indicator is updating. Beautiful. Looks really nice. Looks really easy, right? Like, how hard can it be? That's pretty hard. Let's take a look and see how this actually works. And if this is of no interest to you, please feel free to skip this because it's going to be a lot of math and it's going to be just a kind of a slow walkthrough. But if you're really interested in some of the affordances and what goes into doing this, join me now and we will walk it. Okay, so we basically, let's just back up. Let's open up our home controller. So we know when we're dragging here, this is going to get called. We're going to get this content offset from our scroll view. This is going to tell us how far in the X we have scrolled. Let's go look at this function now where all this magic happens, and let's see what we do. First thing we do, we just get the index of where we currently are in our swipe. So right here when I'm dragging back and forth, this is index 0. And we need to know where we are because we need to know what the constraints are and how to do the leading and trailing here. This would be index 1, this would be index 2, and you can see as we swipe here, we just need to know where we are. So that's all we're doing here. We're taking the content offset passed in from our scroll view, getting the X coordinate, and then dividing it by the width frame, which is 414. That gives us something like almost 0, almost 1, almost 2. And then we convert it into an int, and we have it there. Now, one wrinkle as we're dragging here is if we're at the very start of a scroll, we don't want to actually do anything. So that's what this at scroll start is doing here. It's saying if we're at the very start of a scroll in terms of we haven't even moved a point, just get out of here. There's nothing to do, kick out. So that's all we're doing here. And we need to do that because as we scroll to different places, we've got some padding we need to take into account, which we'll get to. But here's where the magic starts to happen, and this is really the beef of it here. As we're swiping here, each one of these sections, we need to figure out what percent have we scrolled. So if I'm scrolling here, it's like 1%, 2%, 3%, 50%, 75%. That's what we're tracking as we drag here. And we need to convert that into something up here so it knows what percentage to scroll from here to here. That's called a normalization process. So we're taking something the width of 414 here and converting it something that makes sense down here. So when we go percent scrolled, we need to first of all, based on what index we're at, take our X position, divide it by the width of 414, and then subtract 0, 1, or 2, because this will be like 0%, 100%, 200%. We just need to subtract that little bit from it. That gives us our percent scrolled. Then we need to determine, okay, well, what buttons are we working on? What are our from and to buttons? Here we're going from playlist to artist. Here we're going from artist to albums. So that's what this code is doing here. Based on the index, we're setting up our from and our to buttons. Then to make all that nice smooth alpha stuff work, we basically figure out, hey, if we're going from here to here and you have an alpha of 1, you're fully lit, but we're going over to artists, which will eventually have a full alpha of 1 and you'll become 0.5. We basically just take the max of our alphas, which is either going to be 0.5 or 1 minus the percent scrolled. So we don't actually kick in the animation for the alpha until we're 50% of the way. That's when it kicks in right there. So that's what's going on with this code here. Then we need to determine the widths of our sections. So you'll note I'm basically using a switch on my index continuously as we go through here. And I could have combined these all into one, but I thought this is a nicer way to break up just to show you the things that I needed to figure out in order to make all this work. So based on our index here, we're going to go and figure out what our section width is. And it turns out the only one that's really special here is this first case because we've got that little bit of extra padding here. So if our index is 0, our section width is going to be equal to the leading padding here, our from width, which is our playlist width, plus that button space of 36. So that's what this section width is right here, and that's what we're calculating. Then we need to normalize that scroll. We need a sectional fraction which takes our width, divides it by the frame width of 414, and then multiply that by whatever percent wide this is, say 0.27 or almost a third. That's just getting the leading going. Now here we need a calculation to figure out, well, how does that actually translate into a position here? Now when you see the y here, this isn't a y as in vertical in terms of an x and y Cartesian system. I use the y here just more in the form of an equation like y is equal to mx plus b, which if you think back to high school was the equation of a line. I'm just using the y here to represent the output of my calculation. So based on whether it's 0, 1, or 2, I need some special conditions here to figure out how much to set that indicator to. Let's take the very first case here of index 0. This is the case where I actually don't want that scroll to start animating until my x is greater than amount of my leading padding here, which is 16. Because I found if I didn't take that into account, it would basically just jump and it'd be a very jerky motion up here, which would make it sort of animate in a jerky way. So while x is less than the padding, I'm basically saying go ahead and just start animating it. But as soon as we get past 16, subtract 16, then do the remaining percent scrolled. And that's what gives it that nice smooth transition from here over to there. In the case of in the case of artists, here we need to subtract basically this 13 represents the difference in width between this button and that button. Because remember, the button widths are changing. This is something we need to take into account. So this 13, it's not really a magic number. I just left it in here to hard code and show you what it looks like. And then we're in the final case here. We can just do a pure scroll. We can take all of our new x and just apply it to the y and just slide that however we want. So all that goes into determining the leading y. Then for the trailing y, we just need to, this is a little bit simpler. Here we just need to take our trailing y is going to be equal to our leading minus the width offset. So in this case, our width offset would be 13. That's the difference between these two buttons, but here it's 0 because we're just at our very first initial place. So our trailing can just line up exactly here. As we go to this second index, we need to subtract some things. We need to take away the leading padding we added here. And in fact, we need to divide it by 2 because I think we've added it twice. Sorry, that's in the second case. In case 1, we just need to subtract it once, the leading padding here. But by the time we swipe over here, we need to subtract it twice. And that will give us our leading y. And that is everything that goes into this indicator. Now I'm showing you this for a couple of reasons. This indicator is probably the #1 reason why I wanted to work through how Spotify did this. And this just fascinated me how they did this. So this took a lot of time and effort and a lot of a lot of paper and a lot of math and a lot of drawing pictures, trying to figure out, and I'm not even sure if they did it this way. They might have come up with a much simpler way on how to do it, but this is what I came up with. It works. I'm really proud of it, but it did take a lot of work, and you won't need to do this in all of your applications, but we're here to learn. We're here to try different things out, and this is just some of the work that I went into figuring out how it works. Anyways, that's how we can do this horizontal indicator. And just a quick note, I did notice one button I got wrong. Albums, if we go look on our menu bar, the index here when albums is tapped, that should be a 2. Apologies for that. If you run that now, everything should work. There we go. Now we've got our buttons going. Phew, that was a heavy section. Let's take a break and just take stock of what we've done here. We've done some really good stuff. One is we figured out how to hook up these menu bar taps to our underlying screen below. That's what's going to enable us to show something nicer in the next episode. We figured out how to do full paging and update these buttons as we are swiping backwards and forwards. And then we did a lot of heavy lifting and saw just some of the magic that goes into making that green indicator slide back and forth as we drag forward and back. So a lot of really cool stuff in there. Let's just take a pause and stop here for today, and we'll come back next time and we'll see how to do some more standard collection view layout and how to actually make this nice interaction go as well as getting some other data in there. Okay, thanks for coming everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.